Welcome back. You're now watching the lifestyle segment of the weekend show brought to you by HoloCrunch.
Crunchy, yummy goodness.
Awesome. So the topic of discussion today is unleashing African youth innovation and creativity potential during and post-COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in a period of uncertainty for millions of young people in Africa, disrupting schools and academic calendars, forcing businesses to close, and also exacerbating jobs uncertainty and unemployment, with the entertainment and social gatherings having been impacted negatively. On today's program, we have two astute young people who will be speaking to us about this and more.
Razaq Juwon Lawal is the CEO and founder of Africent Group. He'll be joining us virtually. And we also have with us Ojoma Ochai, the Regional Director, Art and Creative Industry, Sub-Saharan Africa, British Council. Welcome to the Weekend Show. Can you hear us?
Yes, please.
Yes, I can.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So, Razaq, let me start with you. As the CEO of Africent Group, how has the COVID-19 pandemic engineered you to rethink the way you do business? And I know you have businesses across the UK, the EU, the United Arab Emirates. So how have you done business now with the lockdown caused by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you, Osasu. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, viewers. Yeah. Okay. I think the pandemic situation is an eye opener, and it has really changed the way we think, the way we do things. And so for African reference, so the pandemic especially has presented an opportunity for Africans to rethink and innovate. So for me and my team, we have virtually used to things like this period to the pandemic. So we have built a structure where we work more virtually and then get things done without seeing each other.
Okay, thank you, Razaq. Ojoma, I'd like to...
I think we need to... Yeah.
Thank you, Razaq. I'd like to bring Ojoma in. The World Economic Forum in June 2020 reported that about 70% of entrepreneurships and startups have had to terminate full-time staff or employee contracts. I'm aware the British Council, and I've done some work with you before, has constantly contributed to the creative economy by supporting startups and creatives with grants and businesses in Nigeria. With COVID-19, how has that affected the work you already do with the creative community in Nigeria? Ojoma?
Thanks very much for that question. So COVID-19, as Razaq has already said, has affected lots of businesses, and many of them are thinking about how to pivot, this word that we like so much now, how to pivot to a digital and a virtual context. And even though it was burgeoning before the pandemic, now is more important than ever. So one of the things that we have ramped up and that we continue to do is around the digital capability that entrepreneurs need to function in these times that we find ourselves. We had started that work prior to the pandemic, but it's just more urgent now. And the reason we started it before the pandemic was because there was lots of research that was pointing to the fact that a lot of the growth in the African creative economy would come from the internet and digital-based activity. And so thankfully, we had already created modules, we created programs. So essentially what we're doing now is scaling that up to give and support entrepreneurs with the digital capability that they need. There's also obviously access to funding. And so we're working with various partners to explore how that might work. And I know that you've introduced me as the British Council, and yes, I do work for the British Council, but I'm also on the board for something called the Africa Tech and Creative Group. And we've just set up a grant scheme for creatives across Africa where we're offering up to $500 on humanitarian basis and up to $2,000 for people that want to innovate to improve their business models to suit the current context. So in the different sort of spheres that I'm interested in, there's certainly lots of interest, both financial and not non-financial, to support creatives and entrepreneurs through this time.
Ojoma, as you've clearly said, there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has proven to be a serious challenge across the world, but the youth have somehow taken advantage of this opportunity to not only evolve, but to re-strategize their way of doing things. We see young people making personal protective equipment, PPEs. We see them making hand sanitizers. We see them making the automatic sanitizing guns. You know, so the youth have become so innovative in their way of doing business. So what are some of the very unique and prosperous businesses that you've seen that has been developed from this pandemic?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've been amazed by what we've seen. One of the partners that we work with in fashion in Nigeria is called The Assembly. The Assembly are a fashion hub. It's run by a woman called Pepper Chikezie. And what they've done is they're making, as you said, medical grade PPE. So they've been supported by CC Hub and they've partnered with the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research. And so they're not only making the PPEs, they're sterilized by the NIMR, so they're medical grade PPE, which is super interesting because in a matter of weeks, they went from making clothing and so on to PPEs. Another company that we know of is Rough and Tumble, who are making PPEs, but also medical supplies, because as you know, obviously the borders were shut, and even though cargo was still coming in, it was much difficult to import lots of medical supplies that had been previously used. And so Rough and Tumble are doing that. But I think beyond the health sector, there's lots of interesting examples that are just using a sort of virtual mechanism to share content. So for example, in theater, there's a company called Oxygen Concepts, and they did a performance of Wole Soyinka's Trials of Brother Jero on Zoom, which obviously before the pandemic, we would not have thought was a possibility. Mm-hmm. And I know that they're working on another production on Zoom. But also we've seen drive-in cinemas, drive-in theaters, and people just adapting to the situation in which we find ourselves. I know people often talk about the new normal that we're in, and I think it's a bit of a cliche now, but it's the reality that the business models have to change. And so whether it's music or film or fashion, whatever sector people are working in, they just need to find new ways. I know the fashion and the film industry have been struggling a bit in that. Obviously, you can't socially distantly make a film, for example. But what kinds of measures can you put in place in this world? So around testing on sets, around isolation of teams, which obviously is going to cost a lot more. But we are seeing that lots of companies and lots of organizations are starting to think about, if this is our reality, what do we do next? The final point on that is we're also seeing lots of content being put on YouTube. For example, Bolale Austin Peters have started to put their productions on YouTube. And I think the amazing thing about that is, I think with, I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it was, it might have been Fela and the Kalakuta Queens. And it was thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, I can't remember, of views across the world. So it's creating suddenly this massive opportunity in terms of audience. I think the missing link at the moment is the commercialization of that, because we now need to find a way to get people to pay. Mm-hmm. Because it's all well and good getting 1 million views or 100,000 views, but we need to find a way to make ticketing possible, a way to find payment possible, and a way to make sure that the creatives are actually getting paid when they're putting their content online. So I think that that's the next big challenge. And for the tech sector, so there's lots of collaboration I see here between, say, the fintech sector and the creative industries to just close that missing link.
Okay, Razak, as a CEO and a business owner, like Ojoma has said, Nollywood, for instance, is the second largest movie industry in the world, where we're producing about 50 movies every week. And now we have a situation where, because of the pandemic, most of this can't happen. And you spoke earlier about being able to pivot, so did Ojoma. We've seen businesses go from catering businesses to now offering delivery services and logistics services, which works more for them. We've seen businesses. I have a friend who bakes cakes, but she pivoted in a way where she started making banana breads, which were a daily need to help sustain her business. Now, the reality is about 40% of businesses generally will run out of funds in 3 months as a result of the pandemic. How do you suggest for entrepreneurs, what steps do they need to take when they consider pivoting in their business in order to ensure that they're sustainable?
Okay, thank you. I think, well, first of all, they need to embrace the new normal and then understand the disruptions that we have seen across all the sectors, especially fintech, healthcare, logistics, supply chain, which fall out to your question. So more emphasis should be placed on method and to adopt to make the journey more accessible, as well as the leader can harness and facilitate the potential. So this potential has to be that they need to think beyond the box and get their business on an e-commerce platform. So they have to go online, and then the logistic as well has gone e-logistics, even though they are still more of physical activities, logistics industry, but everything has gone on mobile application, has gone more technology-wise. So for our people who are in small businesses and they need to survive, so the only way to cut cost and minimize the risks of running out of funding or running out of business is to quickly digitalize their business. And then first of all is to change the way they think. So if you don't change the way you think and change your business model within yourself, the money might not work. Even if you give them money, they might just burn it off and then nothing will happen. So the first of all is to get the new normal, to understand the new normal, and that it might not be temporary, because everybody is sitting on their comfort zone to say, oh, maybe 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, this thing will go, and we'll go to normal. So I don't think it's going to go. So there's something that has changed, and I think it has changed. It's going to change for a while.
Most definitely. And Razaq, I love the fact that you talked about the new normal, because you were recently inducted into the Forbes Business Council. Despite the pandemic, Forbes is a global platform. So what ways or what suggestions can you give to youths to globalize their businesses, especially African youths? Because we find that most times we're stuck in the territory in which we operate. So what advice can you give to youths to expand the scope of their businesses to other regions during this lockdown?
Yeah. Okay. So for me, from my side, I've worked much better, faster, more efficient during this pandemic, and it's been a very good result in all sectors that we are in. So my advice is that don't sit down, identify your own terms, and then take a step, work on it, because nobody's going to advise you on what to do. So people, the youth, African youth, Nigerian youth need to come out and just take initiative and leave their comfort zone. There's no easy cake. There's no, There's no easy funding anywhere, or you have to wait for government, or you have to sit down and continue to complain. So we have made more faster success during the pandemic than ever before. So I'm amazed. Yeah.
But for the youths watching, how do they go about expanding their profile in an international way like you have done? As I said earlier during your introduction, you have a presence in the UK, in the UAE, across Europe. So how do young people who are watching, who are currently doing business in Nigeria or in South Africa or in Ghana, how do they go about expanding to either the rest of the continent or even the rest of the world?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, I think first of all is the foundation. I started in Nigeria. I grew up in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria, and I made and built a lot of sacrifice, And so at the time that I have seen that I've matured enough to go beyond the shore of Africa, and so that really helps. So first of all, I've built that experience. Try the businesses that have been in for the past 15 years and have made many failures, few success. So they need to realize that they have to try to fail first. If you don't fail, failure, it's when you fail, that's when you have experience. So getting out of the shore of Nigeria or Africa, you need to have laid some foundation for yourself. Invest in yourself. So the youth have to invest in themselves. And how do they invest in themselves is to leave their comfort zone and then spend more time, invest in themselves and utilize every opportunity, not to use social media for fancy lifestyle, So any instrument that they legally have can be used to motivate themselves and innovate. And so that's my advice to them, that everybody should start to begin to do something. Find your own terms. Don't look at other people's. What works for Osasu does not work for Juwon, or what works for me doesn't work for Ojoma, So people need to find their terms, what works for them and what their interest lies. So in the course of engagement, you'll be able to begin to see how your experiences lie. And so thereafter, you made a good foundation and you have built yourself enough, you can easily cut across the border of Nigeria, Africa. Okay. So by the time you get out there, people want to try you, people want to test you. Mind you, we have limitation with our nationality when you are out there. So the first thing is they underestimate you. So you need to prove that you are well experienced, well equipped, well cultured, and from there you can begin to excel. Yeah.
Thank you, Razaq. Ojoma, I want to talk about social and financial responsibility. Most times when we talk about entrepreneurship and business, everybody talks about lack of funding, but in recent time we've seen funding come from outside the country and within the country. The federal government has had its creative industries grant or loan. They've also had that for agriculture to support entrepreneurs and small businesses. We've seen the likes of Mr. Easy, who yesterday just raised about $20 million. We've seen 54 Gin, who raised a couple of $1 million also in medical research. But when it comes to implementation, with most young people, it's reported that once they get this money, they buy those flashy cars, they pay for big houses for themselves. And so implementing the projects which they've collected funds for, has ever happened. How do we ensure social and financial accountability and responsibility when we actually have access to funds to ensure that businesses stay afloat?
Thank you. That's a great question. Before I respond, I think on the point of funding, though, I think even though it's changing rapidly and it's a vastly different landscape from, say, 4 or 5 years ago, I still think there's a fundamental problem with the way that the funding landscape for creativity and innovation in this country is structured, in that we have a lot of debt financing, so loans. And if you study any thriving ecosystem of creativity or innovation, you have what we call a mixed model of funding, which means different types of financing instruments. So you would have seed funding at the very early stage, which is tiny bits of money to maybe take your idea from you sort of prototype or very early stage to the next growth stage. And then you have other kinds of funding, even when you've got to that growth stage, not just debt financing, right? You would have angel investing, you would have equity funding. And I think that we tend to inordinately rely on debt and banks and loans. And in the creative industries, as I said, you need other kinds of money, as in many other industries. And I think the result of that, now to your question, is one, is that because there isn't a systemic pattern of sort of growth, because if you've given somebody, say, I don't know, 100,000 naira seed funding for the sake of argument, they can develop their accountability muscle. And then if they fail at that stage, there's a track record that then allows a future investor to be maybe more wary of that business. And so I think both from a company and an investor's perspective, the industry and that funding landscape is suffering from people not having structured financing at the early stages. And so when they run away with the money and build the house, it's when they've got a large sum of money. Whereas if there were different grades of systemic funding or different points of systemic funding, you could have picked up on the issue really early on. I don't know if that makes sense. I think that's one point. I think another point is we have to remember, and I'm not saying this is right, but we have to remember that we're a function of a wider macro environment. And I think that our values as a people have been eroded. And so let's not run away from it. There's a real thing around people not just being accountable, because that's the community, that's the society in which we live. And I think that's a function. So we really need to relook at what are we teaching our children? What are we promoting in the media as being acceptable? What are people seeing other people in positions of power do? And how does that influence our behavior? I think there's also something about systems. So whether it's legal systems, justice systems, I think there's a fundamental macro issue that also needs to be tackled. So if people know that they live in a country where if you call police, nothing will happen, right? You know, there's no incentive for good behavior. So I think there's an industry level problem in terms of what I talked about, finances, financing structures, but I think there's also a macro problem which we need to acknowledge. You cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, as they say. So unless we fix the bigger problems, I don't personally see how we're suddenly going to get young people to behave any different.
Ojoma, that leads me to our final question here. If you could pinpoint to just one activity either the government or the private sector can embark on to unleash the full potential of the innovativeness and the uniqueness of young people across Africa, what would that be?
Just one?
Yes.
Oh, wow. So I think if I could pick just one, it would be a more efficient information flow in the industry. Because I think one of the biggest things is that the flow of information, whether it's information about where to get skills or where to get funding or where to get opportunities, is really disaggregated. And so if you're not plugged into a certain network, even where there's funding, you don't know. Even though I've said that the financing is not effective, it's not effective, for example, the reality is the financing that does exist, people still don't know that those things exist. It's the same thing with skills. It's the same thing with local and international opportunities. So I think if I could fix one thing, it would be around that information. Another critical thing about information is information on return on investment. I think one of the things that holds back private investors, certainly, is that they're not really clear how the return on investment will come. And that is a function of good information and quality information on sort of sales, revenue, and so on. So if I could fix one thing, it would be all the information flows regarding all the players in the ecosystem would be fixed. And I think that alone will trigger a lot more growth than we're currently seeing.
Most definitely. That's a very critical component. Razaq?
Hi.
Go ahead. So one thing...
Yes.
One thing you believe it would be very integral to bringing out the uniqueness and innovativeness of young people across the continent. Just one thing that you could fix.
I think we need to create the learning opportunity to lead and feel in control, which serve as motivation to learn for the youth. Creating flexible work settings work should be open for innovation through training, encouraging individualism and uniqueness. So the environment, I think it's also very important. So adaptable and learning environment, learning should not be rigid and should be open to change and adaptation so that the youth and the young people can easily adapt and make their changes.
Thank you so much. Methods of learning, and I also got flexible work systems from you, and from Ojonwa I got the methods of, excuse me, yes, sorry, from Ojonwa I also got the trickling down of information. Exactly, the trickling down of information systems. Thank you so much, Ojonwa and Razaq, for your time on today's program. We'll take a short break right now. When we return, we are going to have a very inspiring young lady. She's a speaker, a poet, just a phenomenal young woman in which I am very proud. We'll be right back on The Weekend Show. Don't go anywhere.